Welcome to Another Education is Possible, a podcast about education's radical potential. I'm your host, Jordan Corson. If you follow us on social media or you're one of the 2 or 3 people listening all the way to the end of our credits, you'll hopefully engage with the fact that we pair each episode with mutual aid campaigns. That's, of course, because of the impact and urgency of doing mutual aid. And so mutual aid is centered here on this podcast. And we've also talked about mutual aid with several of the guests and how it has an educational aspect. But what actually is mutual aid, and why is it such a critical answer in this moment? And again, what role does it play in education? Today's guest, Rachel Joy, helps us explore these questions. Rachel recently wrote a piece in Hey Alma, of all places, about mutual aid as part of Jewish practice. And in that article, I'm going to quote here. Rachel says, "When there is so much out of our control, it is natural to look for support in systems and politicians. It is natural to want an elected superhero to come in and save the day. However, if my years in movement and political organizing spaces have taught me anything, it's that the same government that is wielding violence against us is not going to protect us from the impacts of that very same violence." And so as we discuss in this episode, whether it's skill sharing or figuring out how we build educational projects through and with one another against these violent colonial regimes, mutual aid is also deeply educational. And so here's our conversation with Rachel Joy. Rachel Joy, welcome to Another Education is Possible.
Thanks so much for having me.
Let's talk about Judaism and Zionism and Palestine in your early education.
Yeah, so I grew up in South Florida in a Jewish household, meaning that everyone in my family growing up was Jewish, and I knew this. I was in a very Jewish area in South Florida. I knew about Judaism, but Judaism was not a large part of my upbringing. My family is not religious at all. I think we're made up largely of like atheists to agnostics to I guess I'll have Shabbat dinner once in a while because my mom would be happy that I'm doing that, but that's about it. And so, as much as I knew I was Jewish and it was like an identity that I knew I had, it was not so important to me growing up. I had very little Jewish education. The only Jewish things we did in my household were like Hanukkah and Passover and like sometimes high holiday services, which I like could not tell you a single thing about when I was growing up. I just knew that I went in fall time and I was in a Jewish area, so we had off from school. Beyond that, never went to Jewish camp, went to just like a few days of Hebrew school, very begrudgingly, but had a very robust Holocaust education and had like a very strong identity and connection to the Holocaust, to my family's survival story, to having grandparents who were Holocaust survivors and great-grandparents who were Holocaust survivors, and having so much information and care and emotion in my home growing up around the Holocaust while, like, having almost no Jewish education was really impactful to me and interesting, and, of course, happy to talk more about any of it, but, just the overview is no Jewish education, a lot of Holocaust education. My mom was born and raised in Israel. I'm an Israeli citizen. My brother's an Israeli citizen. I knew Israel was a country that existed. I had been a few times growing up, but don't think I had ever heard the word Zionism. I don't think I knew what the word Zionism was until like late high school, maybe even after that. Had no concept of like the history or of Palestine or of Palestinians beyond just like, I know there's a people called Palestinians vaguely in that region. I was really, really bereft of any information about Zionism, Israel, Palestine, beyond like, this is a passport that I have that says Israel on it. I don't know why.
Do you have any examples of that Holocaust education, just to dig into that a bit more? Kind of, was it stories? Was it time spent with your grandparents?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time with my grandparents growing up. There were times where we lived in the same house. We saw them every day. My mom's parents specifically, we saw pretty much every day until I was 18 and moved to New York. And my dad's parents, especially my dad's mom, very, very frequently. And all of them either had stories of their own survival, their parents' survival, their siblings' survival. It was talked really openly talked about in my home. We all knew really horrific stories. We knew stories of perseverance. We knew stories of immigration. We just really focused on immigration. My mom has done asylum law in her life. She's an immigrant. We talked a lot about family members who had been denied entry into the US, had been denied asylum into the US, into other countries, and who then ended up in Israel because there was no other option for them fleeing the Holocaust, or who ended up back in the US many years later in a really roundabout way, or one family member who didn't survive because he was denied entry into the US. And we have his like documents from the State Department that say are denying your entry into the United States. And I have a lot of paperwork, a binder of letters sent between ancestors during the time of World War II who had already left and were writing to people who were still in Europe. And there was just a lot of storytelling, a lot of knowledge sharing. I had a few relatives who were part of the Spielberg tapes, and we watched those like as a family many times. And that also was in a Jewish town, so we had so much Holocaust education in school. We had Holocaust survivors come every year. We watched Schindler's List as a school activity. Like, it was really deeply ingrained in everything that I did and was really important to me. There are a lot of things I learned in school and growing up that I was like, this is none of my business. I didn't feel that way about this part of my family history. I felt really like passionately tied to it in a way that had nothing to do with Israel or Zionism, because those two things like were not even connected in my mind, which I think is really interesting looking back, especially given how much like money and effort and time is put into trying to connect those two things in the minds of like young Jewish people. They weren't to me. To me, this was just like an issue of like racism and anti-Semitism and homophobia and ableism and all of the things and fascism that allowed the Holocaust to happen. It had no connection to like this nation state of Israel for me ever, but especially not as a child.
Do you have any insight as to why you think that was? Is it just because at that point Israel was a settled matter? It was taken for granted. Some of the propaganda work that happened in post 67 or times like that had already taken such effect that it was seen almost as background noise.
Yeah, I have some just speculation and then some. I actually asked one of my family members recently after we spoke the first time, she's like, do you have any thoughts about this? And a little bit of the answer that I got and what I just know from my own family is it was their initial immigration to Israel was very traumatic. It was not a triumphant, like, we're gonna go stake claim in this land. It was, we need to survive and no one else is letting us in. This is where we're gonna end up. So I think my family didn't feel that like strong political connection. It was not like a political project to them personally, even though of course it was a political project in and of itself. So there was not a need from my perspective of like, we need to teach our children the importance of this country. It was, we need to teach our children the importance of not letting the Holocaust happen again. And Israel was just like a natural consequence to a lot of them. Many of my family members would identify as Zionists if you asked them, but Israel pride is not and has not been so important to them. I don't think because many of them have like a strong anti-Zionist persuasion, but just that's not the part of the history that is impactful. And I think like that's not the part of the history that was traumatic and like intergenerationally traumatic and violent for them. The part of history that was violent and traumatic for them was the Holocaust. And so that also kind of speaks to like general intergenerational responses to the current moment of like who experienced violence at the hands of the creation of the state and how does that impact their ancestors in today, and why do so many Jewish institutions overcompensate for this? But in my family, that was not part of it. I can't speak for everyone. Maybe they would hear me say this and say like, you're completely wrong. You just don't remember, or we just didn't want to talk about it. There could be another reason. That's just kind of my analysis. My family's not so political as they would probably define themselves. My mom had a very political life. She's a civil rights lawyer. She's an asylum lawyer. She's a high school teacher. She does, which I think is probably the most political job you can have right now in Florida. But beyond her, my family's does kind of cares much more about like community. The conversations in my house were not so politically oriented beyond like my mom, who has this strong political orientation, and then me as like a queer young person in Florida had like very strong political opinions, but most of our political conversations were like me being riled up about things and not them like imposing really any politic on us growing up. And I think this was just like a natural uh like arm of that.
So where did you start becoming political? And since you weren't, by your own um, words, super Jewish, did that change? Did you become more Jewish, and did that happen in parallel?
Yeah, my politicization, I think, largely is credit to my mother, who's very political, but also I knew I was queer when I was so young. I came out as queer when I was 12 in Florida in a school that had never had an out queer person in it before, to my knowledge. And that will radicalize the fuck out of you really quickly. I was in a very homogenous area. It was like a predominantly white, predominantly Jewish, upper middle class, very homogenous, politically conservative town. And here I was showing up to school like I was always a very strange child and showing up like weird and now gay and taking no shit about it, which I don't know who gave me the confidence, who allowed this for me as a child, but they were not happy about it. No one around me was happy about it personally, in school, in many aspects of my life. And I think like isolation is famously the most radicalizing experience. Thankfully, I didn't become an extremist and I just became like a gay, angry person as a kid. But my politicization largely started from like figuring out what being queer meant and like why do I feel so different and what's going on in my area and talking to like my few allies in my life about it, and then growing up, going into high school and getting into fights all the time in my school about like I had to have a permission slip to bring a girl to prom, and I got in trouble for writing for the school newspaper about lesbians. They refused to print the article, and I had my senior quote, my senior year of high school, retracted from our yearbook because it mentioned queer people. And like I was constantly fighting this personal fight and also seeing like all of the other people around me who were experiencing similar reactions to their identities, whether it was people of color experiencing pretty serious racism, very serious racism in my school and in my community, to like many other marginalized folks in our area, immigrants in our area being like heavily mistreated, knowing my experience as like a white person with a lot of privilege in that area was so violent and harmful, and like looking around me and being kind of radicalized by the violence that I saw happening to others. And I was very online. I was a very online child in a really positive way. I think like I will defend iPad kids these days when they're like doing it because they're isolated, and felt, yeah, really radicalized into like progressive politic. And yet like somehow Palestine still didn't come up, which now looking back, I don't really understand that. I was like doing a lot of reading about like race and gender and sexuality, and Palestine was like can't even remember a time that it was mentioned in my own, like, personal learning. And the more political I got, the more hatred I had for Judaism. I always identified as not Jewish. Like, I was Jewish, but I didn't identify as someone who claimed Judaism. It was a mere accident of my existence was how I felt about it. And then I became politically radicalized and was like, "I hate Judaism because I hate organized religion, because all of these books and articles and stories are of people who are involved in organized religion and are being kicked out because they're queer and are experiencing sexual harm and are experiencing all these violences. And so Judaism is a religion? Absolutely not." And that was really like a militant anti-religious mindset. And so I just thought like the more political I got, the less into religion I would become. Then I left Florida. And so much happened, and my world changed in many, many ways. And when I left Florida, it was like a really beautiful thing, but also it was like the hardest time in my life. I had a family member with a very serious illness. I had just lost some folks in my life. I was experiencing some like interpersonal violence. There was a lot going on that was really upsetting. And I moved to New York and I moved for college and I was like very excited to be there and excited to be like queer and political and all these things and still felt like very lost and very confused, and by like extremely ridiculous happenstance met a lesbian rabbi my first week of college and was like, "What do you mean? What do you mean you're a lesbian rabbi? This is not a thing. I've never heard of this." And started talking to her and like very skeptically, and like I was such a bitch to her. I was like really questioning why she would do this with her life, and she was so genuine in her responses to me. And the school that I was at had a pretty radical Jewish community at the time that my friends were, like, literally dragging me to, like, I was like, "I'm not going." They're like, "Well, then you're not seeing us on Friday nights." And I was like, "What is this weird thing that you guys are all doing on Friday nights? That's ridiculous. This is a cult. What's happening?" And then I became part of that cult, and found out that there was Judaism beyond the conservative. My school had, like, an APAC club, which I, like, didn't process what that meant in high school, and now looking back, I'm like, "Oh, this is what was being, like, presented to me as the only Jewish thing," and I hated the kids who were in that club because they were also the homophobes and the racists. And sorry, a facial expression doesn't work well on a podcast, but
Yeah, I think our listeners can fill in the blank to anything related to APAC.
so I that was what I thought all Judaism looked like all around the country, and then I was introduced to, like, queer, radical, anti-Zionist, progressive, complicated, multiracial, lots of different, like, identities, abilities, immigration statuses, Jewish community, and, like, that really changed my life, and I am very identify as very Jewish now. I do Shabbat every week. I run high holiday services. I identify as quite religious and Jewish, which I never thought would be the case, and also I am the most radical I've ever been, so I think we had a bit of an arc, but ended up in this, like, natural Jewish radical place, I think.
I wonder if you could tease out a bit of what was happening in these first moments, because so often you see that narrative presented in this amazing and beautiful but kind of singular way, right? I escaped and I got to New York, and a world of queerness and a world of radical politics opened before me. But it sounds like what you're saying is, yes, that was there, and also there was a lot of complication, not just in your personal life, but in the people you were encountering.
When I came to New York looking for radical community, the words Zionism or anti-Zionism were nowhere in my mind. Like, I had probably thought those words twice in my life and been like, "That's a word I heard. I'll address that later, I'm sure." Um, and so that was not part of, like, my equation of finding radical community, which is, like, now I look back, I'm like, "That is so embarrassing that I didn't know about these things," but it is true, I didn't, and I'll never forget my first week of college, my freshman year. I was in a class where we were talking about I went into college as a major that is, like, kind of a combination of multiple things. That was a, like, Africana Studies and Gender Studies major combination, and was in a class about citizenships and, like, what citizenship means, and first week of school, I'm 18. The icebreaker question, which I learned later we were not really supposed to answer, it was more just something to consider, was like, "Do you hold a citizenship and where?" Understandably, we weren't supposed to answer it, so literally, and I just raised my hand and I said, "Yes, I have 2 citizenships. I have an US citizenship and an Israeli citizenship," and then I just kept talking, and next everyone kinda looked at me, and I was like, "Guess, that's embarrassing that I answered this icebreaker that we maybe weren't supposed to answer," but didn't think that much of it. And at the end of class, this girl who I still talk to once in a while, but I don't know that she knows that this impacted me so much, came up to me at the end of class. It's like, "So you said this thing about being an Israeli citizen. I just want to ask you, like, what organization are you involved in?" I said, "I don't know what that means." At many things in life. I just got to college. What do you mean? And she was like, "Well, do you do like Zionism stuff? Are you like involved in that? Or like, are you coming to our SJP meetings? Are you coming to JVP?" And I'm like, "You just said so many words that mean nothing to me. Explain." And she explained to me that she was the president of this club called Students for Justice in Palestine and a little bit about what they were about. And she was like, "You look confused." maybe you come to a meeting and see what's happening. And I was like, hell yeah, this cool girl wants me to come to a meeting about something that I don't know about. Sure, I'll come. Still having kind of no idea what she was really asking me. Showed up to this meeting a few days later. It was like a 2-hour meeting. It was a introduction to Palestine. It was called like, "It's not that complicated. Palestine 101." And I said, "Sure, I'll learn about this place that I kind of know something about." Like not even really connecting that it is the place that I am a citizen of. And sat in this classroom and saw this presentation and just immediately was like, "Yeah, that all makes perfect sense to me. This is a cause that I care about now. I'm gonna learn everything about this." I signed up for a class the following semester called Imagining Palestine with a wonderful professor, um, who, like, really changed my life, and took this semester-long class about Palestine, read kind of everything I could get my hands on about Palestine and Palestinian history. I went to SJP meetings the whole year. I went to protests. It was a, significantly calmer time on college campuses where I felt like I could ask questions, where I'm sure I said and asked things that were really stupid and offensive and harmful, and we had a lot of, like, spaciousness in these conversations at the time that I feel maybe now there feels like there has to be action all of the time, which I agree, there has to be so much action all of the time, and maybe it makes it harder to have some of those, like, difficult, complicated conversations.
There's kind of a not there's a holding you gently, inviting you in. And I do wonder kind of if there's space for that. I think about that with my own students of how I respond with care and think about where they might end up that's not where they are now. One of the ultimate purposes of education. And there's also something really cool there, which is kind of formalized education and non-formal education working hand in hand. You're going to these SJP meetings, you're learning about Palestine, and that's often, in my experience, running counter to what's happening in institutionalized spaces. You're being challenged to explore more and develop this radical consciousness further around Palestine than you were at a university in 2023. So I would imagine that that changed after the Al-Aqsa flood, after October 7th.
So after I graduated from college, I started working pretty immediately at a Jewish nonprofit, in a Jewish space that was really meaningful to me at previous times in my life, a place that I had been to many times in college, and that was very, like, radical and open and held my anti-Zionism and anti-Zionist communities alongside many other Jewish communities, and so it was really important for me to be in a space that felt Jewish and radical. And then shortly after, started went back to school and started a social work degree part-time, so I'm still doing that, and I, thought a lot about after October 7th and in the months since then, kind of the space that I was inhabiting, both on a campus that I was returning to in a really different moment in time. I was on a campus where I had just spent many, many hours in a classroom learning from an incredible professor about Palestine and talking very openly about, like, settler colonialism and occupation and genocide even before, October 7th, and being really, like, clear and principled in our education in a, like, formalized setting in a class and in another room on that campus in SJP meetings, and holding this campus space as one that, like, of course, campuses have always been, like, elitist and violent in many ways and not this, like, bastion of free thinking that we pretend they are.
Yeah. And I should also interject that I kind of set this up as if it were you were free to explore and talk about Palestine when the Palestine exception might be heightened in the last 2 years, but it has always been present.
Yeah, absolutely, and I was at the time, I think, also holding, like, this is so expansive to me, and I am learning so much and feel so lucky to be in learning from these, like, incredible activists and thinkers, and also, like, we spent a lot of time fearing Canary Mission and a lot of time trying to get people to stop clicking on Canary Mission profiles of the people that I was organizing with, predominantly the Muslim and Middle Eastern students that were involved in organizing. Many of them were put up on Canary Mission. Many of them had been doxxed, had smear campaigns against them. And now looking back, we sometimes laugh. Some of the people that I was with, like, oh, we had it so easy then, but it of course didn't feel so easy then. It was jeopardizing people's citizenships. Yes, even back then, which I think people forget a lot, it was jeopardizing people's citizenships, people's ability to be educated, to stay in these programs. There were physical violence at protests, police repression, all of these things were happening, but it felt very different. And then since October 7th, these same spaces where I was having this like really like radically opening experience just a few years before, we're now watching the same films and reading the same books in encampments. And the students who were doing that in 2023, 2024 were being like violently arrested and expelled and suspended and called anti-Semites and all of these things for doing the same things that like I did in a classroom by a Jewish professor just a few years earlier, and holding all of that while working at a Jewish institution that I had always viewed as this like really like radical Jewish space that was then faced with October 7th and faced with questions and a changing base and changing donors and all of the things that many Jewish nonprofits faced, and chose to change their stance and chose to take a very strong Zionist response to October 7th in a way that was very shocking to me and very destabilizing and disorienting to me, and like my experience of that space that was so affirming to me and my anti-Zionism just a few years before. And so I quit that job and have a new job that is wonderful and very different, and unfortunately not in the Jewish world, because it didn't feel possible to continue working full-time in Jewish spaces, because the ones that were doing the radical things weren't hiring because they were losing all of their funding, and that is its own complicated thing. And through all of this, I was still on campus many days as a student, and seeing so many spaces. I think a lot about the physical space, the way that like physical space has shifted so much every year for like Nakba Day, Yom Ha'atzmaut, usually in April. There was a big groups of students had a party in Washington Square Park, and we counter protested. And I'm thinking about like one year that we had a die-in in the park, and we in the middle of this dance party laid on the floor and put the names of Palestinian villages on our shirts, and there was violence, and that like people continued to dance on and around us. And there was one instance of a Muslim student who was like called slurs and who was kicked at the time, and like it was very upsetting and very violent and not institutionally so. And now protests that are like much less quote unquote disruptive that are taking place where this took place a few years before is seeing like hundreds of police in riot gear pepper spraying and violently arresting and dragging these students for like existing in the same space with the same message that we had a few years before, while the conditions that inspire us to do this message have become materially so much worse. And just kind of like walking around campus and holding these things, it is I don't have such a profound point about it, but it's something that continues to stick with me.
I think the profound point is just to highlight what's happening and show the way that this Islamophobia has both been a permanent fixture and radically heightened. Anti-Palestinian racism, again, has always been around and as you point out, has always been institutionalized, but has taken a shape in the last 2 years where the institutions are no longer in the background and it's kind of woven into the fabric. It's now the colors and the force through which they enact their institutions, which I think leads to, there was a better segue in one of the things you said, but I think there are a number of reasons why I thought it would be great to have you on as a guest. But one core thematic reason is that you recently wrote this piece about mutual aid and Jewish values. I hate to play host, but just if there are one or two listeners who don't know what it is, could you just share a little bit about what is mutual aid? And we don't have to get into we're not going to tease out like Kropotkin's mutual aid. Which mutual aid are we talking about?
Yeah, mutual aid, like generally refers to the ways that we care for each other, support each other, in acknowledgement that the state is not coming to save any of us. So I think that's the distinguishing factor between like mutual aid and other philanthropic ideas, other like ways of envisioning a changing world, is that mutual aid really relies on the belief and the knowledge that I have you and you have me and we have each other, and the state's not part of that. And the state's role in that is actually to tear us apart and to perpetuate violence and to cause harm, even when it looks from afar, from a distance, that they are maybe positioned to help. Mutual aid acknowledges that like we help. We help each other, we help our communities. This can look like distributing meals, having a food pantry, cooking for people in your community, helping people like access information, apply for benefits, figure out how to navigate systems in like the least violent way, planning a fire evacuation plan with your neighbors, especially potent now as like the earth continues to like cry in all of these ways all the time. And then also like the direct financing of giving people money when they're facing eviction, paying a bail, which I think gets complicated for people of like, well, then why is it not mutual aid for me to give to this organization? And the answer is not like it's never mutual aid to give to an organization, but it requires an interrogation of like what organization, who is managing this money, who is deciding who is worthy of the money, what does worthy mean? Will this money actually end up in the hands of someone who needs it, or will it pay a salary of a fundraiser? And like kind of interrogating those questions when we go to do any kind of action to help somebody around us.
And just to put a direct name on what you're talking about here, it's kind of distinguished from charity, because as you hit on, there's so much care and relationships are deeply involved. And that's where I think about, maybe I can speak a little bit about this, but I'd be more interested in hearing from you. I think you're a social worker, so you can, I think that when I hear about relationship and care and mutualism and all this, the social work aspect is evident, but I think there's a deep educational aspect. So before we directly bring kind of Palestine and Jewish values into the fold, I wonder if you see mutual aid as having some kind of pedagogy, if there's a way that we learn through and with the work of mutual aid.
Yeah, absolutely. I think kind of two things come to mind when I think about the like educational aspect of mutual aid. One is like the literal educational aspect of a really important aspect of mutual aid that I think is often really overlooked is skill and knowledge sharing. Not everybody has a dollar to give, and also the dollars may be not always the most helpful thing to give depending on a situation, but all of us have knowledge and all of us have information and skills that we can share. If you know how to purify water and I know how to reverse an overdose, let's teach that to each other so that everyone in my community has clean water and everyone in your community can reverse an overdose. And that education goes a really, really long way. Also, the know your rights piece, especially at now when like political and like political repression and violence, state violence is so heightened, especially in the US right now. Like being informed is really powerful. And even when you can't stop violence against yourself, knowing the information and knowing your rights and knowing the systems and knowing how to navigate when somebody else is coming face to face with state violence is really powerful. So I think there's like the literal knowledge sharing piece. And then I also think like we learn so much about ourselves and our needs and how we exist in the world and our identities and our relationships through the work that we do in community. It is very challenging to figure out who you are and what you want and what you need alone. It's challenging to overcome things alone. It's challenging to figure out like your attachments and your connection to the world when you're alone, and being in mutual aid requires multiple people. Like I'll talk a little bit about this with the Judaism piece, but like you cannot do mutual aid by yourself. It's not a thing. That's why it's mutual. And being around people, especially people who are different from you and in different experiences and with different needs and different knowledges, is so expansive and helps us envision a better world. I think about it in the context of abolition. A lot of my work is in abolition. It requires so much imagination to be an abolitionist, and I think it can be really challenging to envision a better world. Even Palestine organizing, which I know we'll talk more about in a minute, but it's a lot of people respond to anti-Zionism with like, but Israel exists. how could you possibly believe that it shouldn't? What could that even look like? And so to be an anti-Zionist, to be an abolitionist, to be someone who cares about mutual aid is to be imaginative and creative. And I think these like small exercises that we can do every day of mutual aid work helps like grow our imagination muscle and allows us to be in community better generally.
Maybe we should ask, why is it a Jewish thing? Or it's not a Jewish thing. Why is mutual aid part of Judaism? It's of course, you don't have, it's definitely not exclusive to Judaism, but why is it part of Jewish tradition?
When I wrote my article about Jewish mutual aid, I got a lot of responses that were like, "You don't have to be Jewish to do mutual aid." I'm like, "Oh, yeah." There is a Jewish connection to mutual aid in so many ways. I think, like, there's a rich cultural tradition of mutual aid in Judaism. There's, like, a textual tradition of mutual aid in Judaism. I like, the literal Torah talks about loving your neighbor more than it talks about anything else. They're obsessed with loving your neighbor. Whoever you think wrote the Torah, God, someone else, a group of people, they're obsessed with loving your neighbor. And that is truly what mutual aid is. It's loving your neighbor. It's loving everyone you're in community with, not telling you you have to like them. The Torah is not saying like your neighbor. I don't have to like you. I have to love you enough to want you to survive. And I think Judaism is so like rich with that. Also, it gives us like clear ideas and examples, like leaving the edges of your crops for people in your area who don't have access to food. Like there's tangible mutual aid examples in the Torah. There's also like more recent Jewish history examples looking back again at the Holocaust and looking at the ways that people protected each other, thinking about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising as a mutual aid effort, as a mutual aid experience, I think is really powerful and speaks to the ways that like the state will always be the state and will always be violent, and like our power together is strong and is worth it and is important. Thinking about the ways that people cared for their neighbors, hid their neighbors. I think a lot about embodying Jewish traditions now in response to ICE and res- taking it Jewish ancestral wisdom in the ways that we protect like our undocumented neighbors. So I think there's a lot of lessons to learn there. I also think like Jewish values translate so well into mutual aid. I know there's like a question now of like, what is Jewish values? Jewish values to who? People are like really like perverting this idea of Jewish values. I am grounded in Jewish values of B'Tselem Elohim, the idea that everybody is made in the image of God. And if I love God, or I mean, I love God. I'm not telling everyone else to love God, but if I love God and I see that you're made in the image of God, like I automatically love you, and there's not a question. There's no litmus test for love when you're like carrying that in. So I'm grounded in that Jewish value. I think many other people would consider themselves a believer in this idea that everyone's made in the image of God, but struggle to apply it. And I think mutual aid is a way to apply it. And also the idea of pikuach nefesh, of valuing saving a life above all else. I really, really believe in mutual aid as life-saving work. And if we want to honor like Jewish tradition and Jewish values, there's nothing more Jewish than to save a life. It's why it's so hard for me when I see people talk about Zionism, which is like so life destroying as something rooted in Jewish values. But there's this like famous Jewish idea to save a life is to save the whole world, to destroy a life is to destroy the whole world. And I think no one's coming in to save the world. No superheroes coming in to save the world. The way that we save our world, the way that we save each other's lives is through mutual aid. And I think it's a really deeply Jewish thing from my perspective. And you don't have to be Jewish to do it. This is not Jewish exceptionalism about mutual aid, just one way to view it.
I was really glad that you brought, because I was going to ask you about the Warsaw Ghetto example. I think what's interesting is to see that mutual aid, yes, there is this aspect of collective care, and we save us, we take care of us, but it's not leaving out the possibility of collective resistance. And I think that brings us to a difficult position of what does it look like? Of course, we can look at the horrors of the current genocide and also see countless examples of mutual aid being enacted within Gaza every day. But what does it look like to enact mutual aid when the strength of the Zionist border is making it so difficult to build mutual aid networks. How do we study towards that? How do we enact that? How do we create tactics to challenge borders and build mutual aid networks, those in Gaza?
Yeah, I think it's challenging, and I think it's helpful for me when I get very, like, distraught and, like, "There's nothing we can do in this moment," existential crisis, to remember, like, this is not the first time that there's been genocide. This is not the first time that there's been genocide in this region. It's not the first time that there has been such a high level of, like, violence and repression, and trying to ground myself in the teachings of people in the past is helpful to me, and to remember that, like, they did mutual aid and resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto. There's people in Gaza doing mutual aid and resistance every single day. The thing that I think is challenging and potent is, like, how do, like, us as comrades in the US provide any kind of material mutual aid support. I actually viewed, like, the borders in that region and, like, the violent repression and the keeping out of aid and everything in that region as less of a barrier to us than, like, the US role. As people in the US, I think the point of mutual aid is that the government's not coming to save us, and in this instance, the government is actively doing everything they can to prohibit us from caring about people in Palestine, to prohibit us from materially supporting people in Palestine. The, like, entire weight of the, like, US imperial machine is on this issue, and I think that's even more important for us to do everything we can to find ways around it. Um, Obviously, the ways that I would, like, generally recommend mutual aid are not possible here. It's not possible to, like, send food. It's not possible to do, like, a lot of the kind of neighborly things that I would generally recommend. I do think the efforts that have seen that have been the most successful is donating directly to people. A lot of people, there's been, like, a narrative spun for a very long time about, like, the dangers of donating directly to people. I think there's, like, a huge, like, weird propaganda around it. I hear it in New York City all the time from people that I've interacted with over many years of, like, "I'd rather give to an organization than give this unhoused person $5 because what if he buys drugs?" I'm like, "You're also gonna buy drugs with that $5." Whatever, that's a general take, but I do think there's this kind of, like, villainized view of giving money directly to a person. It's viewed, like, not as, like, help valiant, I don't know, as giving money to an organization. But I think specifically in the case of genocide in Palestine, finding individuals who are seeking donations, and it's not hard to find. Unfortunately, there are so many people asking for very specific amounts of money for efforts to flee, for ways to get in contact with their loved ones. Historically for food, now there's no food to spend money on, so, that is more complicated, but finding families, people who are soliciting donations and giving directly into their hands, via GoFundMes and PayPal and all of these, like, online programs, that allow us to circumvent kind of traditional, like, money wiring systems, and also eSIMs. Buying eSIMs has been, like, a huge mutual aid effort. There's a huge push to buy eSIMs for people in Gaza, which is a way for them to get connected to cell service and to make often, like, life-saving communications with each other, and there are some organizations in the US, in Europe, abroad, in various places that are doing the facilitation of connecting people directly to eSIMs, and you can buy the eSIM yourself, you can track it to make sure it's actually getting to somebody, you can see if it's been turned on, you can refill the minutes on it, and things like that, from my understanding, are going a lot further than donating to, like, a large-scale nonprofit that is collecting for Palestine relief broadly, because it's hard to know where that's going to, and it's generally not going into the hands of, like, this man who needs to buy gauze for his wound, whereas donating directly to a person does that. That was a long answer to say, give directly to people.
Yeah. Yeah. Which I think there's a lot in there of, um, I think there's so much about mutual aid that's an affirming of yourself and also a giving up of yourself, right? It's a giving up of, I get to dictate who is worthy of this, who is most deserving. But yeah, I think the takeaway is that, you're offering that there are these tactics, there are these approaches to commit and recommit and continue to push and do the work of mutual aid. So Rachel, I kind of want to close with, I don't want to make you the teacher, and I don't want to have you cheer everyone up when we are in such a terrible moment. We're recording this in end of July of 2025. But, for people who might be listening and thinking, there's nothing I can do because I live in the United States and I don't make enough money to really donate, or it feels somewhat hopeless, or I can only give $10 to this one mutual aid campaign. What do you think mutual aid can offer in this moment? What do you think we can still learn? You said this is a very educational thing. How can we still study and think with mutual aid, and how can we still enact mutual aid?
Yeah, I think sometimes people are driven away from mutual aid because it feels small, it feels interpersonal, and that can feel really scary to be doing something that feels so interpersonal against this like extreme and like unmeasurable, devastating violence in this particular moment, thinking about like just the levels of inhumanity, and the moment we're at in this genocide is unlike anything we've seen over the past few years of like no access to food and so much death and so much violence, and the like imperial machine just continues every day to cause so much harm and to not have any like empathy for the entire population of people. And the way that US news reports is so sporadic, and we're hearing these stories on the ground that are so like really hard to hold and to feel hopeless in the face of. And I think there are a few things that I think about that keep me going. One is the point of mutual aid is that it is not the government. The point of mutual aid is that it's against the government. It is in opposition to the government through caring for each other, because the government views that as a threat. And if you want to feel empowered against the violent machine, mutual aid is doing that, even when it doesn't necessarily feel that way in the moment. The second thing that I think about is Mariam Kaba's belief that hope is a discipline. I think that is really true. I think in order to continue, we have to have hope. And in order to have hope, we have to be really like disciplined and principled in our anti-Zionism, in our commitment to Palestinian liberation, in our commitment to Palestinian people, and to the people around us. And the reason I like the word discipline is because it reminds you that it's not supposed to be easy. This has never been easy. It's not been easy for our ancestors, and it's not easy today. And the last thing that I will say that like I think mutual aid we can be reminded by through the mutual aid work that is happening on the ground in Gaza, the steadfastness of the people on the ground in Gaza, the journalism, especially the guerrilla journalism that is being forced to take place, is mutual aid. It is skill sharing, it is knowledge sharing. The doctors who are maybe not professionally trained as doctors or haven't been for a while, or are coming in from outside and offering life-saving and life-threatening to their own selves services on the ground, that is mutual aid. The poets who are providing like art and culture on the ground amidst a genocide to like keep a peoplehood alive in the minds and the hearts of people around the world, like that is mutual aid work. And I think having this expansive view of mutual aid globally and helping see the ways that we are connected to each other and we are helping each other through like I recognize your humanity, you recognize mine, is also part of it. Also the organization Queering the Map, I'm just gonna throw that in there, as like something that has been really like helpful to me in my steadfastness of like people are like actually like having queer love amidst a genocide, and that is complicated in so many ways, and a reminder of like people will love each other in the most violent of circumstances, and we can do one small fraction of that by caring for our neighbor in our communities, and by donating money for an eSIM and doing Palestine education around us. Like that is such a small fraction of the like steadfastness and care for humanity that it takes to like have love amidst genocide. And I'm holding kind of all of that as I continue my work and as I continue being a human in these like really alarming conditions.
Today's episode was produced by Samantha Haley, Yordain Amran, and me. Please like, rate, subscribe, do all of the things wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also follow us on Instagram, where another ed is possible. Since today's episode was particularly focused on mutual aid, we're going to be sharing even more campaigns than usual and really highlighting them. One that we're starting with is eSIMS focused, and you can check that out. And please do support and give by following links on our Instagram. Thanks as always for listening. We'll be back soon with a new episode of Another Education is Possible.